So welcome. Let's go ahead and get started with our conversation tonight with Professor Michael Tesler and Professor Jonathan Collin on identity crisis, the 2016 presidential campaign and the battle for the meaning of America. I'm Susan Moffett, the director of the Taubman Center for American Politics and Policy, where we're focusing our research and programming on three themes: the cost of living, the value of democracy, and the price of security. And we're delighted to have two experts on American politics and American democracy here with us tonight. Michael Tesler is an associate professor of political science at the University of California Irvine. He's published extensively on this topic in addition to his latest book, Identity Crisis, which is the focus of our conversation tonight. He is also the author of Post-Racial or Most Racial: Race and Politics in the Obama Era, as well as Obama's Race, the 2008 Election, and the Dream of Post-Racial America. You can see Michael's work also often in the Washington Post, and I hear him on National Public Radio on my drives to work in the morning. Michael used to be a faculty member here at Brown. We miss you, Michael. It's good to have you back. And moderating our conversation tonight is Jonathan Collins, who's a presidential postdoctoral fellow and visiting scholar of political science here at Brown. And we're delighted that he'll be joining the faculty at Brown in the fall in the education department. Jonathan has published extensively on race and on empirical manifestations of democracy, on education governance, and on voting behavior. He's also a regular contributor in the Washington Post, and you can find him on in Education Week also. Michael and Jonathan actually have a lot in common. They are both PhD graduates of UCLA. They're both outstanding scholars. They're both outstanding teachers. I often ask my undergraduate concentrators, what courses would you recommend to other students? What do you think students should be sure to take before they graduate from Brown? What professors should they be sure to take? And when Michael Tesler was here, they always mentioned Michael Tesler's courses. And now, even though Jonathan's only been teaching here 2 years, they always mention Jonathan courses too. So two outstanding teachers, two outstanding colleagues as well. We're glad to have you here. So the way this is going to unfold tonight is Michael will begin with about a half hour, 40 minutes or so conversation about his book. He'll engage in conversation with Jonathan for about 15 minutes or so, and then we'll open up for your questions. And then we hope that we can carry the conversation out into the foyer afterwards. This event is being recorded, just to let you know. That includes our question and answer period. Will you please join me in warmly welcoming Michael Tesler and Jonathan Collins.
Thank you so much, Susan, for having me. Thank you for a much too nice introduction. Thank you to Jonathan for his participation. So we're going to talk about identity crisis, in particular the role of racial attitudes in the rise of Trump. I'm going to throw a ton of data out, so the talk is going to be broken up into multiple parts. The first part will talk about the role of racial attitudes in the election. The next part will be talking about the role of racial attitudes in the record Diploma Divide. We'll talk a little bit about the role of economic anxiety. If your faces don't look too glossed over from all the data, I'll talk about Trump and the role of white identity politics. And then we'll conclude with some results from the Trump presidency, finally some results on gender and its heightened importance in the Trump era. All right, but when we're talking about racial attitudes in Trump, I think it's important to know that Trump didn't come out of nowhere, that Trump is, if anything, a symptom of this growing partisan divide by and over race that predates Trump. And so one of the things I think pretty important is that partisan preferences just became a lot more divided by racial attitudes in the Obama era. So when I say partisan preferences, I'm talking about vote for president, vote for Congress, and most importantly, party identification itself. Also, on kind of a parallel track, and this I don't think is as Obama specific, is that partisan politics was also getting more divided by immigration attitudes in the years leading up to Trump. And where you can really see the break is over Bush immigration policy. Sensenbrenner bill in the House, which was a very restrictive bill wanting to criminalize undocumented immigration, versus the McCain-Kennedy bill in the Senate, which was backed by W. Bush, and that was a more lenient path to citizenship. And you really start to see immigration coming to the fore. Also, on top of racial attitudes, you're also just having a growing divide by race. You're seeing low-educated, racially conservative whites, and we'll talk a lot about them today, moving towards the Democrats. You're seeing racially conscious African Americans, meaning African Americans who have higher in-group identity scores, moving towards the Democrats. You're also having Latinos and Asian Americans move to the Democratic Party, but particular Asian Americans and Latinos who have cooler feelings towards whites. We can talk more about that, but this is kind of the stage that's being set. I think one of the most important things when we talk about Trump is the emergence of attitudes about Muslims in the partisan divide. This is an Obama-specific phenomenon. Before Obama, we didn't see attitudes about Muslims predicting partisanship, predicting vote choice. They became a really important predictor of how you felt about Barack Obama. And in a lot of ways, attitudes about Muslims were an easier way to express ethnic-related hostility to Obama than race. And that is where Donald Trump enters the picture. And one of the manifestations of Obama as other of this role of attitudes about Muslims comes in the form of birtherism, which Donald Trump was the champion of. I'll put out this graph really quick. This graph here is from April 2011. This poll here, this Gallup USA Today poll, is actually the poll that compelled Obama to release his long-form birth certificate. Because at this time, it was only about 55% of the public who was saying Obama was born in the United States. And they were like, okay, this has reached a critical mass. We've got to release it after this poll. And one of the things you can see in this poll here is these are Republicans. The only other Republican asked about in this poll in April 2011 was John Boehner and Trump. And then they asked, would they make a good president? This is when Trump was flirting with running for president, Trump and Romney. Some important things, these other Republicans, birther beliefs not doing much work predicting support. For Trump, they are. And these numbers here, these show the number of respondents in each one of these cells. The important thing to note is that there are more Republicans here, pretty equal numbers, in both. And so there was this large group of ethnocentric Republicans who adopted birther beliefs. And this is going to be Trump's key foothold into the party and will ultimately propel him 5-6 years later. 3, 4. 4, 5. All right. Let's go on to the primaries. So I want to do some background on racial attitudes in the 2016 primaries. One of the things that's unique about racial attitudes in the 2016 primaries is that racial attitudes usually matter more for Democrats than for Republicans. And part of this has to do with the nature of their coalitions. Democratic Party has had African Americans, whites, racially resentful whites, racially liberal whites, whereas the Republican Party is much more homogenous in both the demographics and their racial views. So there's more room for race to divide the Democratic Party, and that's historically been the case. The racial attitudes matter more for Democrats than Republicans. But one of the things is that a lot of Republicans, it was harder to differentiate yourself from other Republicans in the realm of race. If we're talking about 2012 or 2008, Trump obviously does that. This quote by Hillary Clinton talking about the megaphone for racial resentment. There was also this interesting previous work on explicit racial appeals. And what do we think about explicit racial appeals? Well, going into the election, the thought was that explicit racial appeal should be rejected, mostly, but other work shows, there's a group who's okay with explicit racial appeals. And these are less educated people, Southerners, men, and Republicans. And you'll notice that that is going to form the key coalition of support for Trump. And so now I'll just go and start hammering you with data. This racial resentment is a variable I'm going to use a lot today. This is basically breaking down, do you think that racial inequality is due more to structural factors like discrimination or more to individual factors like poor work ethic? These are breaking down into quartiles for Republicans. One of the reasons you have to break them down into quartiles is because there's virtually no racial liberals in the Republican Party. There's no Republicans who basically think that racial inequality is due more to structural factors. So this is basically racial moderates to high racial resentment. And what you can see is they're not doing much work in 2008, 2012. They didn't split the Republican Party. Republican primaries are usually fought on an ideological ground. Moral issues sometimes get in there more so than racial and ethnic, but Trump is strongly activating these attitudes. Also, attitudes about Muslims become super important. And this is really the divide between McCain and Romney. Also important to note for attitudes about Muslims, most Republicans live here and here. Republicans have very overtly negative views of Muslims. And so this provides a core source of support for Trump to capitalize on. Moving into the general election, though, it could be harder to activate attitudes in the general election than the primaries. One reason is that we have these fundamental causes of presidential vote, such as partisanship and presidential performance that could overwhelm other considerations. The other one is then, and was my expectation going into 2016, was that Obama was going to put a ceiling on the influence of racial attitudes in general election votes, so that there was no way that race could have mattered more in 2016 than it did in 2012. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to do this project. I was sick of getting hate mail, so I wanted to move on and write something about campaigns. But no, that was not the case. But also, Obama didn't talk much about race. And so Dan Gillian has an excellent book called Governing with Words, where he basically looks at how much presidents talk about race. And Obama talked about race, at least his first term, less than any Democratic president since FDR. I think also important to note is that Clinton tracks left of Obama on racial issues. She talks about this in her memoir, and she says, as a result, some white voters may have decided I wasn't on their side. She goes on to say that's not identity politics, it's simple justice. Also, these identity issues, and we're saying identity issues, we're talking about race, immigration, Islam, gender. These are the issues that dominated campaign ads. And so my co-author, Lynn Vavrick, she loves to look at ads, and she coded them and found that these identity issues were so much more salient in 2016 than they had been in previous elections. And important to note that Americans are paying attention. Americans are well aware that this is the dividing line of conflict. 85% had heard about the Muslim ban in December 2015. By contrast, I saw a poll a week ago that showed like 40% had heard a lot about the Mueller report. And so this is a very high level of consciousness. Majorities consistently say the term racist describes Trump in fall surveys. And most importantly, Americans see a wider divide between the candidates on race in 2016. Let me show you a graph here that's particularly important. So the American National Election Study always asks, going back to 1972, rate the Democratic candidate, rate the Republican candidate on a 1 to 7 scale on how much they support federal assistance to African Americans. Here's the average distance between 1972 and 2004, it's pretty consistent over time. Then you see this big jump up in the Obama era and an even bigger jump up in the Trump era. People are becoming more aware of the racial differences between the parties. Diana Mutz and Dan Hopkins have some data showing that there's also a big difference between 2008, 2012, and 2016 in where they place the parties on immigration. So people are becoming more aware that this is the central dividing line between the two candidates. Oops. And that sets the stage for racial attitudes to matter even more in 2016 than they did in 2008, 2012. Some quick graphs here. This controls for a whole bunch of stuff: party, ideology, demographics, all that good stuff. This solid line here is the 2016 line. These are all different data sources. These dashed lines are Obama's. We can see a steeper slope than on the already enormous slopes in the Obama elections. This here is, these are the same people now. This previous graph, I should say, are different people interviewed at different points in 2016, 2008, and 2012. This data here is panel data, meaning that it interviews the same people over time. This is a survey that we did in collaboration with the RAND Corporation. They re-interviewed 3,000 people who they previously surveyed for their American Life panel. And what we can see again is this gap over here, where you're seeing the defections from Obama to Trump. They tend to be people who score high in racial resentment. This white ethnocentrism measure, this is how you rate whites relative to other groups. Now this looks big. This is a bit misleading in that most of the people live over here. There are few people who say, I think whites are great and all other groups are horrible. Don Kinder calls this subtle but consistent white ethnocentrism. Most people have some ethnocentrism, are about here, but not that many people are like, oh, whites are categorically better than every other group. If they did, though, they would be way more supportive of Trump than Obama. Now, one of the problems, though, is that we don't measure this here until December 2015. And this complicates things because you don't know. Are they changing their racial attitudes? And we'll see some evidence that they are based on how they feel about Trump. Or are they changing their votes based on their underlying racial attitudes? And this was nice. And so what we were able to do, because we were like, we can't write this book before we answer this question about, are people being activated or are they changing? This is sometimes referred to as changing sides or changing minds. And so we commissioned this big panel survey that re-interviewed 8,000 people after the election who were previously surveyed in 2011. The nice thing about this is that we had measures from December 2011 of racial resentment. We had immigration attitudes, things like whether you think immigrants are a net contributor or a net drain on society. And even using these 2011 measures, we see strong activation, that the people who are defecting from Obama to Trump are the people who are high in racial resentment and high in immigration attitudes. Also in this RAND panel, one of the things that I think is particularly important to note is that a lot of this is a Trump-specific phenomenon. And so what I'm talking about here is we asked in April 2016, do you vote for Clinton versus Trump? Do you vote for Clinton versus Rubio, Clinton versus Cruz, etc.? And you see that in a Clinton versus Rubio matchup, things like ethnocentrism and resentment, they're going to matter. These are baked into the party system, especially post-Obama. But Trump, in a Trump-specific matchup, you're really seeing racial attitudes doing work. Both low, meaning people who are racial liberals being more supportive of Clinton, and people who are high in racial resentment preferring Trump to other Republican candidates. All right, So with that quickness, let's go on to racial attitudes and the diploma divide. One of the most interesting things about 2016 was the divergence and the emergence of this diploma divide. When we think about elections in the past, there's this thing called uniform swing. The idea behind uniform swing is that every group swings the same way from election year to election year. So in 2004 to 2008, every group is swinging more Democratic. From 2008 to 2012, every group is swinging less Democratic, except Asian Americans and Latinos, but we'll leave that alone for now. What's interesting in 2016 is that, and you can see this uniform swing in this data here. High and low educated, they swing together. They go down, they go up, they go down, they go up. And then in 2016, they diverge, especially for whites. High educated whites go more Democratic. Low educated whites go a lot more Republican. So this is not uniform swing. This is distinct swing. This is opposite direction swing. And this is very unique. And so we spent a lot of time in the book saying, all right, how are we going to explain this diploma divide? Some people were like, oh, well, it's economic anxiety. We were like, no, I don't think so. And so one of the things, I always say this is the most important graph for understanding the 2016 election. This is Pew Research Center data. Nice thing about this is that they have tens of thousands of respondents every year, so these are pretty precise estimates. And what you can see going on here is this is white high school or less. And from 1992 up until 2008, there's not much difference in how low-educated whites identified. They were equally likely to identify with the Democrats or the Republicans. Then in 2008, they start to diverge, and that gets really big over the course of the Obama years, so much so that by 2016, low-educated whites are 25, 26 points more likely to identify with the Republican Party. This is who Trump is going to come. These were voters who were moving away from the Democratic Party, who were ripe for the picking, and Trump is going to come and pick them up. Some college whites also start to diverge. Interestingly, though, high-educated whites are moving in the opposite direction. And if we were to extend this further, high-educated whites are moving even further into the Democratic camp. So what is going on here? 2008, a couple of easy explanations. One is the financial crisis, the other is Obama. All right, so we argue that white working class flight is largely about race. And the first graph I want to show is this graph here of who can place the Democratic Party to the left of the Republican Party on issues of race. And so this goes back to that previous graph I showed. No college whites, some college whites, and college grads. And the key group here is the no college. Before Obama, and this is pretty consistent across all the years, less than half of non-college educated whites knew that the Democratic Party was the more racially liberal party. College grads were pretty good about this, and they don't have any knowledge gains over Obama. It doesn't take Obama for college educated whites to say, hey, I think the Democratic Party is more supportive of racial issues than the Republican Party. But we see huge knowledge increases in the Obama years for non-college educated whites. Non-college educated whites are now able to know that the Democratic Party is the party that's more supportive of minority rights. And this has huge implications. Oops. One of the big implications is because low-educated voters tend to be the ones who are the most intolerant. They have the most conservative views about race, immigration, Islam. But those views tend to matter less for them because they can't connect them to politics. Obama comes along, simplifies the politics of race, makes it easier for them to connect their racial views to politics. And this is who you see start to defect from the from the Democratic Party over the Obama years. So this is just a breakdown of high racial resentment. And you can see these are low-educated voters, and they start to have a huge drop-off from 2008 to 2012. This is Pew data. This is pretty similar to racial resentment. Anti-black discrimination, not rare. Anti-black discrimination is rare. And you're seeing that your high resentment, low-educated voters were leaving the party. They're ripe for picking up for Trump. And so what this leads to is racial and ethnic attitudes explaining the diploma divide. So let me explain what I mean by that. This is the diploma divide. You see, this is with no controls. This is just the raw data. How much do high school or diploma less with college grad? And without controls in there, it's a pretty steep relationship, and it's consistent, and it occurs in every survey. What also occurs in every survey, though, is if you control for racial and immigrant resentment, meaning if you make it so that low-educated and high-educated whites have similar racial attitudes and statistical models, the entire education divide goes away. And this mediates the diploma divide unlike anything else. It's not authoritarianism, not economic anxiety, not gender attitudes. These attitudes about racial resentment and immigration are really what's driving the diploma divide. What about economic anxiety, you ask? So perceptions of economic well-being in the national economy are significantly linked to Trump support in the primaries. But racial considerations are much stronger predictors in multivariate analyses. This comes out time after time. I don't put that much stock into those, though. What I do put stock into is what's happening in the relationship between economic anxiety and racial resentment in the years leading up to Trump. This is what we call in the book racialized economics. So one of the things that we see is that in 2004, how you thought the unemployment rate was doing, it's not related to your racial attitudes whatsoever. But in 2012, when it's Obama's economy, racial attitudes are. And this happens a lot in the Obama era. Things that haven't evoked racial attitudes before now do. This one here is a particularly good one since this is panel data. This is 3,000 people who we interviewed in March 2008 and then re-interviewed them in July 2012. What's interesting is that in December 2007, we were already in recession. So the economy is undoubtedly getting worse. When we're July 2012, the economy is undoubtedly getting better. However, if you're the most racially resentful, you now think the economy is getting worse. And so attitudes about race are doing a lot on how we think about the economy. Of course, now it's the reverse again. Is that, again, this is another one of our panels. This is December 2011, and this is July 2017. So it's now the most racially resentful who are the most optimistic about the economy. And so a lot of the way we were feeling about the economy came down to our underlying racial attitudes. Also, I think this one is especially important, is that our perceptions of economic deservingness have a lot to do with race. And I will shout out the eminent political psychologist Tom Pettigrew's ultimate attribution error. And what ultimate attribution error gets at is that when whites struggle or when an in-group struggles, their troubles are generally attributed to situational forces like outsourcing. When an out-group, in this case non-whites, struggle, their plight is more often attributed to dispositional traits like poor work ethic. My favorite example of this is from Martin Gillen's famous book, Why Americans Hate Welfare. And what he showed was during normal economic times, the face of poverty is black. During recessions, the face of poverty is white. Why? Because they are the deserving poor through no fault of their own. And I thought that that was pretty, when I read that as an undergrad, I was like, wow, that's amazing. And Obama was hip to this. And in his farewell address, he was like, if every economic issue is framed as a struggle between the hardworking white middle class and undeserving minorities, then workers of all shades will be left fighting for scraps while the wealthy withdraw further into their private enclaves. I was watching that and then text my co-authors, Lynn and John. I was like, Obama's been reading my stuff. And the reason I did is because I did this HuffPost piece a week earlier that did this simple experiment. So the HuffPost does a survey every now and then through YouGov, and I was like, let's put this experiment on this thing. Let's do half, say, average Americans, which is a symbolically white category, and the other half, let's say, African Americans. What I wanted to do here was get into the idea of deservingness and all the talk after the election of Trump and the forgotten men and women, etc. And the results were ridiculously stark. And so this is who agrees with the statement, African Americans have gotten less than they deserve. The red is average Americans that have gotten less than they deserve. There's a number of really interesting results in this graph. One is that the full sample, everybody, well, they're a lot more likely to think average Americans are getting less than they deserve than African Americans, whites particularly. African Americans, no difference. African Americans are equally likely to say that African Americans and average Americans aren't getting their fair share. The real divide, though, comes over here between Trump voters and Clinton voters. Clinton voters are equal. Both groups aren't getting their fair share. But Trump voters, 64% versus 12%. That most Trump voters think that African Americans are getting too much. And that's really the divide in 2016. So when people say, are Trump voters racist? Well, it depends. If you're talking about, do Trump voters actively hate other minority groups? Well, I don't think that that's necessarily the case. Do they think that minority groups are getting more and that hardworking white Americans are getting less? Yeah, that's the dividing line in the Trump era. And Trump's very good at exploiting those attitudes. I think I'm going to skip over this because I'm already hitting you with way too much information. But we can come back to white consciousness and, I'll do this one graph because I do think this graph gets at the economic anxiety and kind of the political dissatisfaction. This is during the primary. This year is October 2015, so Trump is leading in the polls at this time, but is still only around 30%, 25%. And they asked this question on the Public Religion Research Institute poll. Do you think people like me, how well does the government represent the interests of people like me? And that's not doing anything. So like this idea that now the government isn't responsive to the people, that wasn't doing much work in early Trump support. How well is government representing the needs of whites? That is doing work. Likewise, this question of how worried are you about you or your family members losing their job? Does a little work, but not much. This question of how likely whites can't find jobs because employers are hiring minorities, that's the big dividing line in the primaries. That's what we call racialized economics. That it's not about self-interest, about how I'm doing. It's group interest, about how well is my group doing vis-a-vis others, that is really the power of economics. So we say economic matters most when it's refracted through race. All right, so this is how we'll conclude. Got more data, of course. There's never an end to the data. And the data says that the crisis continues. So we have our afterword coming out in, I don't know, sometime later this year. And this is one of the graphs from the afterword is on attitudes about immigration and vote choice for Congress. This should have more information, but it doesn't. So this controls for all the stuff again. And views of immigration here are measured in December 2011. Views of immigration here are measured in 2014. This is the same big panel that we've been using for this before. This is a Pew panel that's been ongoing. It's a very valuable resource called the American Trends Panel, and we're seeing the same thing happen. 2012, vote for House of Representatives, not doing much. It's doing something. but then we're seeing this big activation of views about immigration in vote choice for Congress. What we're also seeing more of is growing divides over gender. And so gender is one part of this story that I feel we give short shrift to. Part of that is because of my co-authors, I'll blame them. But part of it is also because the attitudinals aren't doing the same work as the racial and ethnic ones in predicting vote choice. I do think that part of this is that one of the things when we're looking at these relationships, they're driven by both the liberal end and the conservative end. And what you saw in 2016 for gender, and this is where gender and race differed for Clinton and Obama. Obama always lost at the high end of racial resentment, but he was able to offset it through increased minority voting patterns and racially liberal whites. Clinton loses out on gender from the sexists, but doesn't offset it with female voters, with male voters who have more liberal gender attitudes. There's one side of it, whereas Obama was more two-sided. One of the things we're seeing too is that attitudes about gender are becoming more important. Again, these are panel results, white women especially. Now the good news about this, at least on this measure here, is that there are as many white women here as there are all the way over here. So, but again, we're seeing attitudes about gender. Modern sexism, I should say, are questions like women who complain about harassment cause more problems than they solve, and women often miss out on good jobs today due to discrimination. We're seeing that activated. Kavanaugh hearings also have an important role to play. And you're seeing a much greater relationship. This controls for a whole bunch of other stuff, including racial attitudes. And you're seeing, so one of the interesting things about Kavanaugh by far the most unpopular nominee ever for Supreme Court. Part of this is record Democrat opposition. But even controlling for partisanship, you see people who are low on hostile sexism, a measure very close to modern sexism, move from Gorsuch to Kavanaugh. And this plays out in 2016, where you are seeing, we didn't see racial attitudes. We saw attitudes about immigration. We didn't see racial resentment. Racial resentment's already an enormous predictor of how you were voting in congressional elections in 2012. But for white men, attitudes about gender aren't doing that much. Now we're getting both sides. Here we're seeing some both-sided action, where low sexism moving away from the moving away from the Republicans, high sexism moving towards the Republicans. And then these are just growing partisan divides over gender. We're seeing increased polarization over gender. These modern sexism questions, Democrats moving one way, Republicans moving the other. And so gender attitudes are increasingly getting politicized and dividing the two parties. We're also seeing growing tolerance, but growing polarization over race, immigration, and Islam. And this is a very persistent pattern across multiple surveys. This is racial discrimination is the main reason why many black people can't get ahead these days. What we're seeing is really strong movement from the Democrats towards accepting the structural causes of racial inequality. And this is producing an overall growing racial liberalism in the American public, but Republicans have been pretty stagnant. So while it is moving the country towards growing liberalism, it's also increasing polarization. You see a similar thing with immigrations today strengthen the country because of their hard work and talents, and the Islamic religion does not encourage violence more than any other. And you're seeing this across basically all these questions that involve race, immigration, and Islam. You're seeing growing liberalism, but growing polarization as well. Republicans are mostly stagnant. Democrats are moving to the left. All right, that was a lot, but some conclusions about racial attitudes in American politics in the age of Trump. The growing partisan divide by and over race, this is probably the most important. Trump expands the growing racialization of mass politics during Obama presidency, although Trump opponents are becoming significantly more tolerant over time. This, I didn't talk about because I skipped over the white identity stuff. We can come back to it in QA if you want. But Trump could spark a growing influence of white identity in partisan politics, and in fact, we are seeing this. We are seeing white identity start to emerge in ways that it didn't before. One thing that's also particularly important, this has really interesting implications for 2020, is that both parties are foregoing their longstanding electoral temptations of race. And this is coined by Don Kinder and Lynn Sanders, called these the electoral temptations of race. And their argument was that Democrats have an electoral temptation where they need to retain these racially conservative Reagan Democrats, swing voters, without alienating their non-white voting base. And so their electoral temptation is racial silence. The Clintons of the 1990s are kind of the quintessential example of that. Meanwhile, the Republican Party needs to appeal to these racially conservative Reagan Democrats without appearing to be explicitly racist and have the backlash. So their electoral temptation is racial code words. And both parties are moving away from that. You're seeing Democrats talk explicitly about racial equality, that so much so that reparations is now a major issue in Democratic primary politics, and you're seeing Republicans speak more explicitly about race. Lots of 2018 ads, not just Trump, but Republicans explicitly appealing to prejudice. And so that has dangerous implications. And if this continues, identity issues should rival ideology as the dominant partisan cleavage in the age of Trump. This is especially important because identity issues are emotionally charged in ways that attitudes about limited government are not. When you're talking about what the marginal tax rate should be, you're probably not worried that violence is going to break out. When you're talking about who counts as an American, how we should deal with issues like the border wall, those are intractable, and those carry with it the possibility for explosive polarization and potentially violence. So I'll leave it on that happy note. Thank you.
Wow. Michael, that was fantastic. Per usual, you give us more data to bite on than can fit in our mouths, right? Like every time I see Michael, it's like this unlimited, this sort of bottomless pit of graphs, right? So it's always and so to go with the graphs, very, very great book, right? Very well written. I enjoyed reading it, and I'm happy to have the opportunity to talk with you about it. I won't waste too much time because I want to get to the Q&A. But I have a couple of questions about some things that kind of came up during your talk, but I just kind of wanted to know more about. The big thing to me, there we go, all right? The big thing that I found the most, well, everything was compelling, but the thing that I thought was really compelling was the media chapter, where you make the claim that, and you back this up, you make the claim that Trump's rise is a function of all the media coverage that he's getting during the campaign. And you illustrate, you show us that consistently during the Republican primary, and then even leading into the to the general election, his coverage from the national media, from television media, was just this float that sort of carried him to victory. My question is, I bought it, but I wanted to know how you kind of reconcile with what you say in the, I think it's the second to last chapter, where you're talking about, well, kind of skepticism towards what's going on with Cambridge Analytics and the Russian hacking and the potential effect of internet ads playing a role in skewing voters. So you're skeptical about this, but you show us how much television media attention is one of the things that's carrying Trump. So I'm curious, like, how do you reconcile this? Is it just different usage rates of media, or like, what is it that's going on here? And so I don't know if we want to do one question at a time, or
I'll go.
a few more, or
Whatever you prefer.
hey, you can.
All right, I'll take that one. So the media, this was one of the issues of disagreement among the co-authors, and probably our biggest disagreement is that I wanted to bash the media over the head repeatedly. My co-authors not as much. But really stake out normative claims about the role of the media as gatekeepers. And that was but I digress. And so
They make too much money from the media.
Believe me, I've had that conversation.
There's a conflict of interest between authors and the media.
Very true. Very true. But I will say about the media, and the big difference, I think, comes from the primaries versus the general election. And what you see in the primaries is this enormous correlation between media coverage and polls. And part of that is just you got 17 candidates. And so right now, Mayor Pete's going to have his moment. He's in the media. He's getting some buzz. He's getting coverage. And this typically happens. And in their prior book, my co-authors, Sides and Vavrick, did this thing where they talked about discovery, scrutiny, and decline. And so you have a moment, you have a good fundraising moment or a good announcement, or you perform well in the debate, you start to get the media coverage, and then you get the momentum. That is often fleeting. And so the question is, why wasn't that? So somebody like Herman Cain was a good example for them. Comes along, gets the buzz, gets some scrutiny, and then declines. The question why doesn't that work with Trump? He's getting the media, he's getting the scrutiny, why doesn't he decline? And that's where the media section marries with what I was presenting, is that it's not just that Trump's was this product of vacuous media hype, but that the media message was all the stuff that I was talking to. We called it hunting where the ducks are in the Republican Party. It's that Trump was willing to hunt where the ducks are. The other Republicans, not so much, and part of this has to do with norms of partisanship, but also donor networks, in that Trump is not beholden to the Koch network. He don't care what they think. Kochs want low immigration. I mean, they want high immigration. They want easy trade. They want open borders to an extent, cheap labor. It's good for growth. So you have these Republicans who are more confined by that, and Trump is free to go beyond that and hunt where the ducks are, speak where their language. One of the stories I liked when we were researching the book was, how did Trump come up with his campaign message? Well, he had some of his cronies, including Michael Cohen, listen to like 1,000 hours of talk radio. And what were they talking about on talk radio? They were talking about immigration. And so Trump is able, that's how he forms his message, as he knows that the base is up in arms about immigration, and he goes and hunts where the ducks are. In the general election, it's different. And so in the general election, the more media coverage a candidate got, the worse they were doing in the polls. And so this is because they were both so negative that when Trump was in the media, he was losing. Clinton, there's only a very few times in the entire election cycle where Clinton gets more media coverage than Trump does. This was Comey's first announcement of not bringing charges, but saying she acted extremely recklessly. This was the 9/11 week, where you have both basket of deplorables and her fainting, and then Comey too, the October 28th number. The rest of the time, the more Trump is in there. And so we basically break it down where primaries media is amazing. There is no bad media in the primaries, especially if it's conveying this message. And this is what Trump is criticized on. So after his June 2015 rapist announcement speech, what do? You see Macy's drop him. You see Miss Universe drop him. You see NBC drop The Apprentice. This is all negative coverage. But if you are where most Republican voters are on issues of immigration, that's all good. That is great publicity. And so that's the story. So it's very much a Zoller story of information plus predisposition.
Wow. So great answer, Michael. I could talk about that aspect of it all day too, and also how Hillary Clinton is spending more on campaign ads. She's putting out more campaign ads, but it also seems like campaign ads aren't doing the same type of work that just media was doing, or at least staying out of the media to an extent was doing.
Yeah, and so one of the cool things about this project is that our co-author, Lynn Vavrick, she, along with John Gear at Vanderbilt, was doing this amazing real-time ad testing where each week they would take the ads that were being shown and they would do very large randomized experiments. And those, it was hard. I mean, and that's one of the things is the persuasion in primaries is easy. You have 17 candidates and you don't have a partisan anchor. So when I was explaining to my public opinion class last quarter, I was like, well, if you don't like the way Elizabeth Warren handled her DNA issue, great. Thank you, next. And you just cross it off and you go on to the next person. And so it's very easy. Preferences are very malleable in primaries. In the general election, it's hard. And so we're in this world where the economy seems to be mattering less, ads seem to be mattering less, and it's because of this intense polarization.
Well, what I found interesting that was also going on, or I guess maybe wasn't going on, was that, and this is kind of a shift to the racial attitude stuff, that the Diploma Divide is doing more work than what traditionally you would expect to be doing the work, which is region, right? So, it seems like the results are consistent across whether you live in where there is whites in the South versus the North versus the West, Northeast. So did you do any specific test around region and sort of population density, and just give me your explanation of why you think why education was sort of doing more work than these more geographic things, or if they're interacting, or kind of what's the story?
So they are interacting, and you show it at the county level, you can show it at the state level, that the enormous relationship between 2012 to 2016 and what proportion of a state or a county has is low educated whites. There is a rural-urban divide that we don't get into as much. And going back to your question about why is it education, and so one of the things that always comes up, what about income? Income is not predicting these shifts, it's education. And I think it is because education correlates so well with these racial attitudes. The urban-rural divide doesn't, and so this is one of the things we don't get into that much. You can knock out that diploma divide with a variable or two of racial attitudes. You throw the urban-rural divide in there, and it still pops. And so we weren't quite certain how to square that circle, and so we're like, that seems more complicated than Kathy Kramer has an excellent book on this topic, and so we were like, let's stick with education. And I do think it is education because of the cultural connotations of education.
Yeah. So how do you, man, I could keep, I'm going to throw
Keep
these
it.
last couple out and then we'll go to Q&A. But, man, so how do you explain kind of in hindsight why less educated whites voted for Obama before voting for Trump, right? So you kind of frame it as like, well, here are, racial attitudes helps us really explain why less educated whites were moving from Obama to Trump. But like, why were people with with negative racial attitudes voting for Obama in the first place? And this kind of brings us back to Obama's race and some of your previous work. But I wanted you to say something about that. Was it that the economic evaluations had not been racialized? Was it Romney's, relative to Trump, his mild racial messaging? Was it Obama's high media coverage that he got during 2012 as being an incumbent? Because you talk about incumbency advantage, or was it kind of something else? Also, if you had to make a choice, which would you say was doing most of the work? Would you say it would be white identity, which is, feeling that your group is under threat, or racial resentment and having negative attitudes about racial and ethnic minorities. If you had to choose between the two, I mean, obviously, I'm sure there's a lot of overlap, intersection here, but like, if you had to disentangle and say, okay, this is the one that I really want to address, that I think will do the most work. What would that be? And related to that, what will it take to get racism out of presidential campaigns? Right? Little conversation starter, right? So, economic growth became racialized. So can you check that off? Racial solidarity won't get you media attention on the campaign trail, probably. We saw the deficiency of party discipline in the invisible primary story. So what do we do? Like, how do we actually get, Trump's messaging around negative racial attitudes is kind of sort of like, meat to the base type of behavior that you document that's going on. How do we get this out of presidential politics?
Okay, those are three excellent questions. Going to the racially resentful Obama voters, the answer, I think, there is partisanship. Partisanship is a lagging indicator. It's hard to move, meaning that changes in partisanship are slow over time. And you saw that with the Pew graph, if you remember, where it starts off 2008 and the low-educated whites are equal, and then they slowly divide. And that tends to be how partisanship moves. It's crazy that partisanship is thought to be the unmoved mover, but it isn't, meaning that partisanship can and does change. And so in 2008, you had way more racially resentful Democrats than you do now. And when you're talking about anything in a presidential election, partisanship usually wins out. So those racially conservative, those were Democrats and Democratic leaners, and they were leaving the party. And so I think that that's the best explanation for that. The question of racial attitudes and white identity is a really good one. I tend to not like these race variable type of analyses. And so you can answer that question two different ways. One is in terms of overall magnitude. There's no question that racial resentment is a stronger predictor than white identity. However, what is maybe more, maybe something that is more unique and more remarkable is that white identity mattered at all in 2016. And this is because historically white identity has been a weak predictor of vote choices. And this makes sense when you think about where does identity gain power? Identity gains power from discrimination, deprivation, and isolation. If you're white, you're in the majority. Not only are you in the majority, but you have a share of wealth and political power that's far greater than your numeric majority. And so there is less reason to feel threatened and to organize around that collective identity. And so historically, you have not seen white identity matter much in public opinion. Under Trump, it does. And so still isn't dividing the parties as much as these racial attitudes. But the fact that it's mattering at all is probably more remarkable than the relationship between racial attitudes. The last question about when will racism disappear from campaigns, when it's no longer in one party's interest to pursue that message. And so some of these trends that are happening, it's going to be eventually very difficult for national Republicans to win on overt racism. What I do worry about, though, is increased geographic polarization, where on a national level, it's a losing strategy. But in your home district or in your home state, and we are getting into a place where the Senate will become increasingly unrepresentative, where white states with low populations, I think I saw some number where it's like 80% of the population will be represented by 25% of the Senate. I don't know if that's right, but there was this good New York Times piece by David Leonhardt that said the Senate is affirmative action for white people, and that is because there are places like where I live that are very racially diverse have 2 senators for however million people. And so I do fear that you're going to see an increasing divide between local and national. And so when it's no longer in the party's interest to appeal is when you will see it end. The question is, I don't think it will not be in their interest in a long time, at least on the state and local level.
A glimmer of hope, then you snatch it away. We'll open it up for questions. All right, this is a really, really fascinating topic. I could go all day. So if you don't have questions, I could keep going. So we'll open it.
Hi.
Hi.
It's been said that.
Oh, we have a mic. Oh, we have a mic.
Sorry. It's been said that the white males are in decline, and the last election, 16 was 16 was their last gasp. Do your numbers, support that?
Oh, yes and no. So, on the one hand, the influence is declining. On the other hand, whites and low-educated whites are still an enormous voting bloc. And I think really importantly is that they're efficiently distributed, meaning that, we waste a ton of votes in California. And when you're looking at places that have a lot of low-educated whites, those tend to be your more swing states. And so from a national perspective overall, yes, their influence is waning. Their influence should continue to wane. But they are efficiently distributed for both the Electoral College and the Senate, and congressional districts to a lesser degree, but still better, more efficiently distributed than the Democratic coalition. And so that, along with potential rules changes, potentially the way the courts will interpret election rules changes, those could make it hard, even with declining numerical support, to have their influence wane. And so,
Were they to do away with the Electoral College?
were they to do away with the Electoral College, I don't think there's any doubt that their influence would wane, and I think that that's why you will never see the Electoral College be done away with.
Thank you.
Okay.
So I think I understood what you were saying with the graphs, and it was very convincing and persuasive. In my heart, I always wonder about, and I know this isn't your thing, but I always wonder about, will a woman ever be elected? And a couple of things you said about gender one thing sounded like gender bias went along with racial, and another graph seemed as though it didn't matter. But I'm wondering, do you have any suspicion? Do you know of any studies on this? Because, in my heart, I feel like possibly people who are racist are also, there's an overlap with sexism. And, I've just watched this and I'm like, okay, Obama got elected. What will it take for a woman? I just feel like, all of that.
So
Can I actually ask
Oh, please.
two-finger on that? So one of your graphs, and I'm not sure I read it right, and so that's why I have a question about it related to hers. It looked like it was actually the white women with greater racial resentment who had higher support for Trump than the white men. Is that true? Or was I not reading the graph?
I think it was a
correctly?
sexism graph, yes.
So it's actually women that are driving it more than men.
So there are not that many white women who are in that most
Okay.
sexist, and so, but yeah, and this is something that we do give Clinton props for in her memoirs, where she said, hey, sexism just didn't just hurt me among the men. There were a lot of women who held these sexist views. Going back to your question, I think that it's undoubtedly the case that Clinton was hurt by gender more than Obama was hurt by race. And so in my first book, Obama's Race, which is about the 2008 election, we have a chapter on race and gender. And one of the things that is striking is that when it comes to racial attitudes versus gender attitudes, there's no contest between the two. So much so, in fact, that the sexists in 2008 were actually more likely to support Hillary Clinton. And this is because racial attitudes and gender attitudes are correlated. And when you control for racial attitudes, that relationship goes away. But on net, the more you thought that women's place was in the home, the more likely you were to support Hillary Clinton in 2008. So we get into the distinction, though, between gender attitudes and then kind of race versus gender penalty. And so we have a section in that book that's called the unquantifiable impact of gender. And this is where I wanted to push my co-authors to go more on, of what a difficult landscape it is for a woman to navigate. And you saw Hillary Clinton do this in both elections, having a hard time navigating. And so long literature in gender and politics on the double bind, meaning that women have to worry about being tough enough or smart enough, but then likable enough. My wife is a professor in political science, and it is very applicable to professors. We live the double bind. I have enormous male privilege versus what she has to do as a professor. And that carries over into gender strategy. And so one of the things in 2008 is Hillary Clinton's chief strategist, Mark Penn, who is an awful human being, but said, here is your role model needs to be Margaret Thatcher, Iron Lady. And the adjectives used about her were not of warmth and humor. They were on strong, tough leadership. It's so hard to navigate those worlds, especially when you're Hillary Clinton and have been in the game for so long. I do think other candidates in 2016 may have an easier time navigating that than Hillary Clinton did. Hillary Clinton has just fought so many friggin' wars over gender and politics that it's hard for her to change identity and kind of move from one message to the other. In the book also, and this is something that I did succeed in getting, we talked about a lot of other ways that gender, I think, affected Clinton. Media coverage, undoubtedly, this is something she talks about. And then also, and there is some research on this that supports the idea that women are held to higher ethical standards than men. And so women are punished more for moral and ethical transgressions. And so we have one graph in the book that shows over time, people thought Trump was more honest. His honesty rating goes up. Clinton's honesty rating goes down to the point where Clinton is rated as less honest by the end of the campaign than Donald Trump. How could any person be less honest than Donald Trump is the question. And I do think it is because Hillary Clinton, as a woman, is punished more harshly for certain transgressions, even though her transgressions, I would argue, are not in the same ballpark league stadium as Donald Trump's.
I'm curious about age.
Yeah.
And how that plays into these attitudes about race and gender. And on the one hand, it's tempting to think like, well, younger people are coming in, attitudes are changing, and then you see all these like Richard Spencer kids, and it's like, I don't know. So.
Yeah, so Debbie Schildkraut, who's at Tufts, she's a brilliant political scientist. She's working on this question right now. And she's framed the question around, are the young people going to save us? And her answer is categorically no. That you can prime these attitudes among young people to the same degree. And there's also a book coming out that's called Racial Stasis by Candace Watts-Smith and Chris DeSante. And they look at youth attitudes over time. And what they found is that this current generation is not particularly racially liberal. I do think this could change, though. And because regardless of how you feel about race, young people do not like Donald Trump. And there is something in political behavior research that's called generational imprinting. The idea that you are in your formative years right now, what is happening in American politics right now is going to have more influence on your partisanship and political beliefs as a young person than my political beliefs as an old person. And because young people hate Donald Trump, I shouldn't say hate, but it's basically a 70-30 breakdown in support among young people for Donald Trump, that even if you weren't necessarily the most racially liberal person, you look and say, I don't want to be associated with that guy. And so that, I do think that some of these trends where you're showing greater racial liberalism, I haven't looked at them by age, but I would not be surprised if young people are becoming more over time. And so I don't know if Debbie Schildkraut has looked at it since the Trump presidency. So I'll give you wishy-washy. There's reason to think both.
There's a question behind you.
So race is becoming a more important factor in determining political behavior. Is that because the racial attitudes have changed, or because some people are just becoming more effective at digging into it and using it as a basis for forcing political change?
It's a phenomenal question, and the answer is both. And what you saw during the Obama era was more this activation. There was less change in the racial attitudes and more activation, that people were able to use them more. You also see this with Trump. You know, these pre-Trump attitudes are becoming more predictive. But you're also seeing changes in racial attitudes in a way that's pretty extraordinary. And so one of the things about racial attitudes is they thought to be much more difficult to change than Rose has some stuff on outgroup attitudes and genetics, and so they're socialized early. They have a heritable component to them, and so the fact that they are changing is pretty remarkable. And so, short answer is both.
That begs the question: why racial attitudes changing?
So, I would say a number of reasons. I would boil this down to basically three main factors. One is the fact that there's a stronger emphasis on racial inequality today than I've seen in my lifetime, at least. And that things like Black Lives Matter, things like the Democratic Party now having a strong position on racial attitudes, that's very important. And so this book that I mentioned, Racial Stasis, what they argue for the racial stasis are a couple things. One is that this newer generation is more removed from the civil rights struggle, and so had previously seen racism as less of a salient thing. Now with heightened awareness, social movements, Trump, that's becoming that is helping to break the stasis. The other is Trump. And so this is one of the things that we saw, is that people really dislike Donald Trump. And so the people who like Donald Trump, well, you can't really make them more racially conservative because they top out. What you can, and what you need to worry about, though, is that attitudinally, though, does that change to behavior? And so and there is some evidence that you may not be able to make them more racially conservative because they're already off the charts on that, but maybe you can motivate them to action. You had a lot of racially conservative Democrats, though, and they dislike Trump for a lot of reasons, and they become more racially tolerant. The third is this idea of thermostatic public opinion. And so one of the things we see all the time, healthcare is a great example of this. During the Obama years, Obamacare is unpopular. It's about minus 10 points throughout, net negative. And then Trump says, I'm going to get rid of Obamacare. And what happens? Well, public opinion starts to pull against it, and this happens consistently. It's a very consistent trend in aggregate opinion. And so I do think the fact that Trump is pushing so hard on these issues, that the public, like a thermostat, pushes back. And so we historically haven't seen as strong. Paul Kelstad, who used to be a professor here, he has some work on racial attitudes and thermostatic public opinion, but they hadn't exhibited such strong pushback. And I think that is because nobody was pushing on them, at least in the last several decades, as hard as Donald Trump was. And so I would say increased efforts by activists in the Democratic Party, hatred of Trump, and thermostatic public opinion are what's helping to change these attitudes.
Here, and then
Two kind of connected things about media. You're clear in saying that
the media helped Trump during the election process more in the primaries. How do you think it's helped him since he's been elected or hurt him? And secondly, along the same line, you've got kind of a reversal for the 20 election, and that we've got at least 17 and counting Democrats on the other side, and probably only one candidate on the Republican side.
Yeah, and so I think at least for the Trump presidency, not that much. And the stability of Trump's approval ratings are astounding. They are and you see dips every now and then, and that is media. But when we're talking about Trump's overall approval, and you're thinking of something like Donald Trump saying, I am going to shut down the government. I am taking responsibility for shutting down the government, when 70% of the people think you should not shut down the government. And that's only changing his opinion by 3 points or so. You see one of these, and this is the same on Mueller, is that Mueller is not going to make Trump more popular, and this is probably a little dip in, I would imagine Trump's media coverage might be a little more favorable. But attitudes about Trump are so baked in, and I think this will change during the campaign once it's a one-on-one matchup. And so one of the things that you saw over the campaign is that, and this could be less, is that when Trump was in the news doing crazy stuff like, criticizing the Khan family or criticizing Alicia Machado or something crazy, John McCain, you would see Republicans, they were the ones who were driving these changes in Trump's approval rate, in Trump's poll numbers. And Republicans were like, whoop, I don't know. I don't want to be associated with that guy. And so they would leave, and then as soon as that story would fade, they'd come back. And this was the good timing for Trump, is that they had left him after the first debate. They'd left him even more after Access Hollywood, which is early October. And then they come back, and then Comey helps bring them even further back. They may have come back regardless. And so the question is, are those Republicans still going to move around over the election when bad stories come about Trump? I'm not sure they will. They haven't over the course of the presidency. So I don't think there's as much room to move the needle anymore because opinions of Trump are so fixed. And one of the things, Trump's not getting credit for the economy either. And so there was a fake poll, I don't know if you saw, that Trump tweeted out, where 58% approval on the economy, 55% overall. The 58% approval on the economy was real. The 55% approval was fake. It was 43% approval. But there is this disconnect, and we show in the Obama years and the Trump years that he's not getting credit for the economy. And I think that is because attitudes about, there's nothing that could happen right now that's going to change a lot of people's opinions about Trump. For the Democrat, though, it might be different, especially who is new. If it's a Biden and Trump matchup, there's probably not much wiggle room there. But if it's a new candidate, if it's Mayor Pete or Kamala Harris, who people don't know as well, then I think there could be. For the Democratic primary, a lot is going to be on who starts to get the media attention. And so the debates in June will be important. Who performs well is going to get more media attention, and they will likely see a surge in the polls. Whether that'll be lasting or not depends on, is there substance behind it, and are they able to withstand the scrutiny?
We got a question here in the back.
Thanks for your talk. I was just wondering how this populist trend and the associated racial and gender trends compared to populist movements in other countries, and how did those populist trends resolve? And do we have any hope?
So unfortunately, my knowledge is embarrassingly Amerocentric. So we have my comparativist colleagues like to give me a hard time about this, that we have this whole book and that we have exactly a page and a half on European trends. There does seem to be similarities, in particular the activation of white identity in European politics is a very, very strong predictor of how you felt about Brexit. I've seen a couple papers on Brexit that have a similar type of racialized economic story, where it's not how well you think that you're doing economically that was predicting support for Brexit. It was, how do I think whites are doing vis-a-vis other groups? And so my guess is that it would be that these trends would be pretty similar, but unfortunately, I don't know enough.
And how are we on time? 'Cause- Emily.
Hello, Professor Collins. I haven't totally figured out how to ask this question, so I'll just give you the scenario I'm thinking of. So I study education here. I'm a senior. I'm training to be a teacher, and I'm moving to rural Idaho next year as a teacher into a district that has 8% of the population, of the adult population, has a bachelor's degree, and it's majority white, and it's just kind of like that Trump voter identity, basically. And I'm wondering about students that I'll be teaching who have gone through high school in this Trump era and beforehand. And I think the school district has like a 20 to 30% college go-on rate. So those students who have grown up in this area with parents who most likely are, strongly Trump supporters, and then go to college. That diploma divide, I'm really curious what you think that'll look like after students who've grown up in the Trump era, then some percentage of them go on to college.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a hard question, and it gets into the question. What's hard about the role of education in racial attitudes is that nobody really knows what's going on there. There's this big education divide. Is it because you're socialized into greater tolerance? Well, then that might make it hard in terms of, my mentor, David Sears, he did this study of attitudes over the course of UCLA freshmen. And so they tracked them, they looked at them time and time, and what does he find? Well, he finds that they become more racially liberal over the course of college. Well, that's UCLA. And so what if it was, I wanted to do this once when I was here, and I had a friend in grad school who was starting BYU, and I was like, we should do the same thing. I should track Brown students. You should track BYU students. Will they be the same? And so it could be a socialization component to it. It could be a teaching tolerance component. I have a colleague, Sean Rosenberg at UCI, who thinks it's a cognitive component, that when you learn more complex ways of thinking, you tend to think in terms of, hey, there are reasons for inequality that are more complex than, oh, this person isn't trying hard enough. And so I wish I had the answer. It's a great question, and it's one where if you could untangle, you would make a huge contribution to social science.
Well, thank you for all of your contributions to our understanding tonight and to social science. Thank you.
And Jonathan. Please